So let's talk about evolutionary psychology. You know, it's funny, I teach philosophy of biology and I don't talk about evolutionary psychology in that class, but I do in this class for reasons that will maybe become apparent. We'll see. But because this is a different class than the philosophy of biology class, I have to give you a quick primer on evolutionary theory. Um, some of you are already very familiar with this, but I suspect fewer than think that they are. So then we'll talk about evolutionary psychology, and then we'll talk about some problems with it. This might be the longest lecture for the next month or so. The rest of these get shorter after this, so hopefully we'll get through this. The recap is the same as the previous lecture, although I do want you to remember the biases and heuristics from the behavioral economics discussion. This is the observation that we have these predictable errors of reasoning. This was the anchoring effect and all of those things that I showed in class. So, all right, let's start with what is evolution. One definition of evolution is the effects of a population by evolutionary processes, usually resulting in change over time. Life on Earth is at least 3.5 billion years old. Basically, as soon as we have any evidence of rocks on this planet, we have evidence of life on this planet. Charles Darwin, one of the big proponents of evolutionary theory, was not the first evolutionist. He wasn't even the first evolutionist in England, or even the first evolutionist named Darwin in England. His grandfather was an evolutionist. But his big contribution was this idea of evolution of species by means of natural selection. Importantly, it was non-progressive. I'll say more about what that means later, but it basically means life isn't getting better. It's just getting better fit at the environment, but because the environment's also changing, there's no sense in which anything is getting better over time. It's just changing. In Darwin's view, he thought that we could make sense of how species look and behave based on similarity due to ancestry. We'd known creatures were similar looking since the time of Linnaeus, but Linnaeus thought that the similarity was due to how God's mind was organized. With Darwin, similarity is due to common ancestry. We look similar to chimpanzees because there was a common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans. We look less similar to orangutans because our ancestor was farther in evolutionary past, and so on and so forth for all evolutionary distance. To understand evolutionary theory, you essentially just need to understand these three things: variation, heredity, and differential fitness. The way I like to describe this to people, evolution by means of natural selection is just guessing and checking over millions of years. So variations are the guesses. These can be mutations. These could be things that arise naturally. Heredity is how you get to figure out what's the best option, how you maintain any evolution that you get so it doesn't go away. And then differential fitness is the checking, right? Some variants do better than others in some populations. So the idea is you start at some time zero, and there is one, I guess here it's a blue dot and one blue organism in a sea of green organisms, but it is so well suited to its environment that eventually it starts taking over, and then it takes over pretty much entirely. That is a means of evolution by natural selection. It's just better at its environment. If it happens by chance, it's just called evolution. We have lots of evidence for this. We have evidence from doing it to birds and dogs and crops and cows and all sorts of things in farms and in labs. We have evidence from shared structures. Here I have bones from forelimbs of fins, paws, and wings, and you can see that all of the bones are structured in the same way, which makes sense if you were modifying based on an ancestor, but not if you were creating them from scratch. We've also seen evolution happen in a lab over tens of thousands of generations over decades. We've seen E. coli evolve to be able to consume citrate, which doesn't seem like that special to you because you're really, really biased as a macrobe, but that would be roughly the equivalent of evolving a human to eat garbage and do better. We have evidence from the fossil record. You can line up massive extinction events, you can line up geological changes with fossil changes, and they line up with each other very well over time, suggesting that there's a replacement. We've seen evolution happen in the wild. We've seen it occur in what are called natural experiments, where something happens in one place but not in another, and then we compare what happened to the organisms in both places, and we see that there's changes over time, depending on what happened. And we have evidence from genes. We discovered this over about a century after Darwin. So Darwin was not aware of this, could not have been aware about genes at all, did not have a good mechanism for heredity. And nevertheless, when we start looking at this genetic material that you inherit from your parents and they did from their parents, and so too for all other organisms, you can see similarities over time that map onto roughly what we thought the distances were just based on observation. Basic terms here are natural selection. So when nature favors an organism or disfavors another organism, such that they have either lots of offspring or they die, that's called natural selection. Evolution is just change over time, and that could happen by lots of processes. It could just be chance. It could be a byproduct of something else. It's when you combine evolution and natural selection that you get Darwin's insight. And that is the guessing and checking over millions of years. Over time, if you have enough rounds of selection, the organisms that were not killed, that had lots of offspring, their descendants survive and represent the population more and more. So over time, species begin to resemble successful organisms. And note that success here is not based on any objective metric. There's no sense in which organisms or species are just getting better overall. They're getting better fit to their particular environment. And the environments change, so species change. And you might imagine going toe-to-toe with a Neanderthal or with Homo habilis or with some of our rodent ancestors and actually doing worse in their environments or in this environment. There's no sense in which we're getting better. You could say we're smarter, but that's privileging one particular change that happened as opposed to the many, many other changes that have happened. Evolutionary theory is not complete. It is not written. Lots of aspects of it are very, very well established. But in the century and change since Darwin, there's been lots of discoveries, lots of additions from Mendel's theory of genetic inheritance through when it was synthesized with Darwinism, the discovery of DNA's importance and its structure, arguments for different levels of selection, arguments for different processes going on in biology. All of these have added to a rich theoretical tableau. And you are taught a cartoon version of them in class, unless you go to grad school in biology, basically. Even this, I've just gone through a very quick detail over very complex and lots of issues in biology. So it is a very well-established field that is very explanatory, but it is ongoing. So let's get to evolutionary psychology. It's the application of evolutionary theory to humans. And this had actually been speculated since Darwin. Darwin in The Origin of species by means of natural selection actually argues that maybe natural selection could explain some traits of human psychology. And he specifically talks about altruism and group selection, which we'll discuss later on in this section. About a century later, W.D. Hamilton argued for something called inclusive fitness, which is essentially the view that sometimes it's called kin selection, although kin selection is a narrower version of it. That basically means that there's a reason you should prefer to save the lives of your siblings or your parents to a complete stranger given the option. And that's because you share a lot of genes with them, and so in a sense, it's like your genes are saving themselves or their copies. Robert Trivers pushed another view, another process that happens in biology in 1971. This is the idea of reciprocal altruism. Why should we ever try to benefit? Why should we ever help a stranger? Why should we ever help anybody? Well, because they can help us in the future. And so if you're the kind of person that is helpful, you're likely to be the kind of person that gets help later on. And if you surround yourself with helpful people, you do better than people that are loners. All of this was to help vindicate some psychological traits, namely why you would help strangers or family members or whatnot. In 1975, E.O. Wilson published a book called Sociobiology, which is a really insightful book that kind of spawned some really intense debate in the literature, in which he argued that it's not just inclusive fitness that is helping your family members, and it's not just helping strangers one-on-one. You might actually also be able to talk about social features, perhaps group features, that help explain certain psychological traits. So this is the idea that if you were on an island and you met somebody from Reno and somebody from like New York City, you would prefer to help out the person from your hometown because you would think of them as part of your group. In the 90s, so sociobiology is attacked and is abandoned for a while. But then in the 90s, with some of the research from behavioral economics coming up and some of the other research coming up, some people started trying to resuscitate the idea of sociobiology and combining all of this intellectual history to a new and novel approach to explaining human psychology. This is a view that they called evolutionary psychology. And so Cosmides and Tooby argue for something called evolutionary psychology that has essentially 5 basic premises. It's got the computational theory of mind, thinking about the brain as a physical system that is designed. And here design is not going to be due to a designer, but rather through the appearance of design that you get from guessing and checking over millions of years, namely evolution, by means of natural selection. So the brain functions as a computer to generate behavior to fit your environment. This behavior was designed by natural and sexual selection to solve problems that our ancestors faced, not necessarily problems we currently face. We are conscious, but that's just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, most of what's going on in your mind is probably hidden from you. And some of these neural circuits are going to be specialized for solving different problems. These problems are problems that our ancestors in the Pleistocene faced. So our modern skulls house a Stone Age mind, is the slogan. One of the first problems that evolutionary psychology purported to tackle was the puzzle of altruistic behavior, which I've already gestured at. This is the puzzle of why organisms act in ways that help other organisms, which we find all over the place in biology, from plover birds eating the stuff that's stuck to crocodile teeth to uh, all sorts of other, like this picture of a mouse and a toad, um, which doesn't seem to just be limited to kin. And some people have argued that it might have some genetic basis, but if natural selection, so this is a cartoon version of natural selection, if it favors, quote, selfish behavior, you would imagine that somebody could always just pretend to be altruistic and get all of the benefits and exploit altruists forever, taking advantage of altruistic behavior. So why does altruistic behavior nevertheless persist when it's obviously advantageous for creatures to try to take advantage of the people that are altruistic? Well, there's a lot of research on this. It's one of the more interesting problems in this area. And in fact, this research had been explored well before evolutionary psychology in something called evolutionary game theory. Now, game theory is essentially the study of strategic interactions. We tend to break it down into economic game theory and evolutionary game theory, in that there seems to be a sense in which economic game theory, which purports to be about rationality, and evolutionary game theory, which is the guessing and checking over millions of years, they nevertheless tend to converge on similar outcomes. There's a kind of a rationality toward guessing and checking. So in evolutionary game theory, there are puzzles that have specific names. Some of these names you may have heard of. For example, the prisoner's dilemma, that some people argue are actually pretty good at modeling behaviors that happen in biology. We assume the participants are purely selfish in these models, and that cooperation is not a strategy that's likely to win. And in fact, if you set up a lot of these situations, these prisoner's dilemmas, which I'll show you some, I'll get into detail on this in a little bit, you can actually imagine civilization collapsing based on this setup. It's a problem where helping somebody else hurts you. So the prisoner's dilemma is roughly this. You have two, quote, players, two individuals, two entities that are in a strategic situation with each other. They have the option to either cooperate or defect. Cooperating benefits the other player, the other organism, the other person. Defecting does not. It benefits the person that defects. And so the way to read this is, suppose player B chooses to cooperate. Player A has a choice. You want lower numbers here because these are going to be punishments. The way this is originally set up is you get arrested by some police with somebody else, and they offer you, both of you, the same plea. If you turn on each other, you each go to jail for 5 years. If you refuse to turn on each other, you, quote, cooperate. You still go to jail for a couple of years for obstructing justice. But if you were to turn on the other person and they don't turn on you, you get to go off scot-free, and they have to go to jail for 10 years. So if we're doing this in human psychology, you can imagine this happening all over the place, not without police officers. Just why would you help somebody else in a situation? In nature, this happens all the time. I'll show you some examples shortly. But okay, you're player A, you have you know for a fact player B is going to cooperate. You have this choice. If you cooperate, you get punished 2 points. And this is arbitrary. Make it 2 years, you lose 2 years of your life, whatever. It is better to lose 2 than to lose 1, and based on the rationality that we've asserted ahead of time, you prefer to not suffer 2. So you would choose to be defect. On the other hand, if you're player A and you you know that player B is going to defect, well, you would much, much rather defect then, because um, either they get off scot-free and you go to jail for 10 years, you suffer 10 units, or you both suffer 5. You might as well, 5 is better than 10, so you should defect. The exact same reasoning applies to player B, because this is a symmetric situation. So player B would opt to defect regardless of what you decide to do. And you would defect regardless of what player B decides to do, because defecting is always better for you. But that ends up being that both players defect, both players suffer more. They suffer 5, as opposed to the 2 that they could have suffered if they both cooperated. This is called the prisoner's dilemma, in that it seems like the rationality forces us to suffer worse than if we were being a little bit more trusting, a little bit more altruistic. So in the 70s and 80s, we started doing experiments on this to do the math to work it out. And it turns out that if you know how long you're going to play with somebody, if you know how many times you plan on interacting with somebody, it's beneficial to turn on them. In fact, to turn on them first, which usually means to turn on them immediately. But when you don't know how many times you'll interact with them, and you expect that you'll interact with them again, then this sort of becomes a situation where you extend each other some sympathy, some trust, and you hope that each other will be altruistic. You get a reciprocal altruism. So Axelrod invited a bunch of computer programmers and biologists, people from all around the world, to design strategies to play against each other. And it turned out that the strategy that won the most was not the strategy of cooperating every time or punishing every time. It was a strategy called tit for tat. This strategy, both players begin with the assumption of cooperating, but then they copy whatever their opponent did the previous round. And so you can imagine, going back to this prisoner's dilemma, if you both cooperate, then the next time, if you're doing tit for tat, you just repeat what the other person did. You cooperate, and you keep going. If for a moment they defect, well, then you just suffered 10, but the next time you'll defect, and you'll be stuck at 5-5 for a while until they decide to cooperate again. You'll defect one final time, and then cooperate from then forward. Interestingly, it seems like this behavior, this tit for tat, was not just something that was discovered in the lab, but this helps to explain a lot of behavior that we see in nature. Species aren't suckers. They cooperate if given the chance, but they will not continue to cooperate if they're taken advantage of. And they don't even have to be that smart. They can be very simple. This is a 3-spined stickleback, a very famous model organism. This experiment was done where they put an image of a predator or an actual predator in a compartment at the end of a fishbowl, or sorry, a fish tank. And you start off a couple of sticklebacks nearby, and then they wander around, and you see whether they will get close to the predator. If one gets close and the other one doesn't, then that one, the next time you put them in that same zone, they will not get closer again. Sometimes. So, okay, the idea is, if somebody is a cheater, if somebody chooses not to cooperate when they can, then tit for tat is an interesting strategy that can prevent somebody from being taken advantage of forever. That makes sense. If you can tell how close another fish got to the predator, or whether your opponent the other player in the prisoner's dilemma turned on you or not. But if you can't tell, then uh, tit for tat can never evolve. So Cosmides and Tooby take some of this research and they think of it as helping explain the presence of some altruism. And they propose that there's actually something called a cheater detection module, a process by which we can tell when somebody turns on us. And this might sound ludicrous at first, but let's try to give it benefit of the doubt for a second. Before I do that, I need to remind you of behavioral economics and how we make these consistent reasoning errors, right? I showed you some availability errors, some similarity mistakes, some loss aversion, cognitive errors. Humans are actually really, really bad at certain kinds of reasoning. So if you've taken philosophy before, the terms modus ponens and modus tollens ought to be familiar to you. Otherwise, you've taken the wrong classes in the wrong order. But these are essentially the easiest, simplest forms of reasoning. If you have something, then you have another thing. You have that one thing, therefore you have that other thing. It's just how the word if works. If you behave, we'll go to this, get ice cream. You behave, therefore we get ice cream. On the other hand, let's say your parent tells you, if you behave, we'll go get ice cream. You come home and the other parent sees that you didn't get ice cream. They can infer that you didn't behave. All right, so these are very, very simple reasoning. This is logic, basic logic. And in basic logic, usually you spend a day trying to convince students of this because students are actually pretty bad at this. We tend to confuse the two top forms of reasoning with the two bottom ones that are not good reasoning. If you behave, we get ice cream. You got ice cream, therefore you behaved. That's not actually true at all. You could have gotten ice cream on your own. You could have gotten ice cream because I was a softie. And then the last one, if you behave, then we get ice cream. You didn't behave, therefore we didn't get ice cream. No, you could still have gotten ice cream on your own, right? I was only saying that if you behave, I will be the one that goes and gets you ice cream. It didn't imply what would happen if something else happened. So that's the kind of reasoning that you learn in early logic, and it turns out humans aren't logical. If I give you this rule, I say, if there's a vowel on one card, so every card has a red and a green side, if there's a vowel on one side, then there's an odd number on the other side. And I ask you, which two cards do you flip over? Well, most students, when I ask them, get this wrong. And I'm sure you'll get it wrong. Pause this video if you think you're going to get it right. Unless you've taken logic, you probably won't. If there's a vowel on one side, then there's an odd number on the other side. Most students understand to flip over the E card to see if there's an odd number on the other side. If it's an even number, then the rule is false. But then a lot of students think that they should flip over the 5, not realizing that it doesn't matter what's on the other side. The if vowel then odd was one direction. It didn't say anything about if odd then vowel. A lot of people also think about flipping over the C for some reason, which I don't get. There could be an odd number on the other side and it wouldn't affect that rule. It just tells you if a vowel, then there's an odd number. What you should flip over are the E and the 4. because if there's not a vowel on the other side of the E, that is, that violates modus ponens. And if there's not if there's not an odd number on the other side of the E, it violates modus ponens. And if there's not a vowel on the other side of the 4, it violates modus tollens. Which again, makes sense if you have studied logic, but probably not in general. On the other hand, like, let's say I attach this to a story. I tell you, you're a bartender. The rules say anybody that's under 21, you should card. So a 10-year-old shows up, a 90-year-old shows up, somebody who you didn't see at another table orders a beer, and somebody you didn't see at another table orders some tea. Who do you card? If you get this wrong, you should never be a bartender. You card the person that's underage, obviously, and you card the person that ordered the beer because you didn't see them. The other two, maybe you card, depending on how stringent your state is. So Cosmides and Tooby did some studies on this to try to show the exact same reasoning applies even in fictionalized cases. They made up an imaginary island. On one island, only married men had facial tattoos. Cassava roots were a prized delicacy. They were like a dessert. Molo nuts were bad, were bitter food. So these are 3 facts about this imaginary society. Married men have facial tattoos, cassava roots are good, and molo nuts are bad. And then they made up 2 stories. In the first case, married men live on one side of the island, and that's where cassava roots grow. Unmarried men live on the side where molo nuts grow. On the other story, only married men have the rights, the privilege. They've earned the right through getting married. Only they are allowed to eat cassava roots. It turned out that in the descriptive version, most people get the answers completely wrong. This is the exact same structure as the logical case, as the bartending case. It is logically identical, but you got the numbers and vowels wrong. You might have gotten this one right. You got the bartending one right, hopefully. Hopefully. People just do better when you attached it to social exchange. And what they argue is if somebody who doesn't have the right to eat cassava roots eats them, they are a cheater. They are not being a good citizen. They are not being altruistic. And our minds are honed to be able to catch cheaters that violate some rules for society in a way that we're not honed to capture correlations of who lives on what side of an island. So the story is the solution of an adaptive problem explains the emergence of the cheating detection system, and that explains the patterns of error in logical reasoning. I have to go through a lot of effort in my logic classes to try to teach people logic, but bartenders don't have to learn basic logic in order to learn who to card, because evolutionary psychology holds, because we are naturally good at detecting cheaters. So if we switch it, if we switch the benefit so that you can, if you eat the cassava root, then you get married, then it turns out people find it very difficult because that's not usually how we work. Detecting violations doesn't quite work the same way when you're not showing a violation of some fundamental rights. Because that one is not, even though it's logically identical in a lot of ways, it's not the cheater is violating the situation, right? It's not the getting the benefit without paying the cost, even though it's logically identical. So the evidence here seems to be that we're good at identifying cheaters. Okay, I'll stop that there and go into the objections to this in the next video.